They were supposed to be on the same side. Same war, same enemy, same flag flying over every building in the city. But on the December night in 1942, two Allied armies stopped pretending and tried to destroy each other on the streets of Melbourne instead. Bottles flying, fists connecting, military police outnumbered and scrambling just to restore basic order. Dozens detained, zero newspaper reports. By morning, the Australian government had buried every single word of it. No headlines, no investigation, no official acknowledgement, just silence, carefully, deliberately enforced. This is the Melbourne Riot of 1942, and the reason it was buried tells you more about the true cost of the Allied alliance than any official history ever will. To understand what happened on Burke Street in December 1942, you need to understand what Melbourne had already been through by the time that fight broke out. Australia in 1942 was a country running on fear and exhaustion. The war had been going since 1939. Australian men had shipped out to North Africa, to Greece, to Crete, to the Western Desert. Entire communities had reorganised themselves around absence, around the men who had gone and the women who stayed behind to hold everything together. Then February 1942 arrived and rewrote everything. Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin in the largest foreign attack ever carried out on Australian soil. Over 200 people were killed. 8 ships were sunk in the harbour. The raid shattered the assumption, the comfortable, unexamined assumption, that the war was somewhere else, that it happened to other people in other places, that Australia, by virtue of its geography and its connection to the British Empire, was somehow insulated from the worst of it. 2 weeks earlier, Singapore had fallen. More than 15,000 Australian soldiers taken prisoner in a single defeat. The largest surrender of Australian forces in history. Prime Minister John Curtin, in language that was unusually direct for a wartime leader, told the Australian public plainly, Britain could not save them. The old imperial relationship was finished. Australia would have to look elsewhere. It looked to America, and America came. Hundreds of thousands of US servicemen flooded into Australian cities across 1942, using the country as a staging ground for the Pacific Campaign under General Douglas MacArthur. Melbourne, as the country's largest city at the time, absorbed a significant portion of that influx. Within months, the city had been physically and socially transformed in ways that moved faster than anyone had anticipated or prepared for. The Americans brought with them equipment, manpower, and the strategic weight of the world's largest industrial economy. They also brought something else, something that turned out to be far more complicated to manage. They brought money. The pay disparity between American and Australian servicemen in 1942 was not a rumour or an exaggeration. It was a documented structural reality that shaped every social interaction between the two forces from the moment they shared the same cities. An American private was earning roughly 2 to 3 times the wage of an Australian private of equivalent rank. In practical, day-to-day terms, that gap restructured social reality completely. An American GI on leave in Melbourne could afford things that were simply out of reach for his Australian counterpart. He could take a woman to a restaurant, not just a bar. He could buy rounds without calculating whether he'd have enough left for the tram home. He could tip generously, dress well, purchase items on the grey market that rationing had made scarce for everyone else. The Australian soldier standing next to him, who had in many cases been fighting since 1939, who had earned his place in this war in blood and mud long before the Americans arrived, earned less, spent less, and occupied a visibly lower social position in his own city. That contrast was not invisible. It played out in public, every single day, in every pub and dance hall and restaurant in Melbourne. And for the Australian men who, experienced it, it generated a specific and very personal kind of rage. The kind that comes not from abstract injustice, but from watching something unfair happen directly in front of you, repeatedly, with no official acknowledgement that anything is wrong. If you want the full picture of what that social landscape looked like, the dance halls, the courtships, the war brides, the lasting consequences for Australian women and families, that story is told in detail in our other video. The link is in the description, and the two stories are much stronger together. But for now, understand this. By December 1942, the social temperature in Melbourne had been climbing for months. The pay gap was only part of it, but it was the part that made everything else impossible to ignore. The pub district along and around Burke Street in central Melbourne was, in 1942, the social heart of the city's working class and military life. These were not upmarket establishments. They were the kind of places where men went after shifts, where soldiers on leave came to feel like themselves again, where a cold glass and a familiar face provided some temporary insulation from the weight of what was happening in the world. By mid-1942, American servicemen had become regulars throughout the district. They came in numbers, they spent freely, and they occupied space with the particular confidence of men who had not yet been tested in combat, but who carried the social advantages of a higher wage and the novelty of being foreign. Australian men on leave, in training, working essential industries, waiting for deployment, increasingly found that the pubs they had grown up in felt different, louder, less theirs. The tension that built through the second half of 1942 was not constant fighting. It was something subtler and in some ways worse, a persistent atmosphere of barely managed hostility. The wrong look across a barroom, a hand on a shoulder that stayed a beat too long, comments made just loud enough to be heard, men holding themselves back, not because they weren't angry, but because they understood at some level that they were supposed to be on the same side. That restraint has a limit. And in Melbourne, through November and into December 1942, that limit was being approached from both directions simultaneously. Accounts from veterans and civilians who were present in the city during this period consistently described the pub district as a place where confrontations had become increasingly frequent and increasingly difficult to de-escalate. Small incidents that would have ended with words a year earlier were now ending with shoves. Shoves that would have ended there were now going further. The city was a composition waiting for a spark. December 1942 provided one. What exactly triggered the Melbourne Riot? Which specific word? Which specific shove? Which specific moment crossed the line from tension into violence is, like most riots, impossible to establish with clinical precision. Witnesses remember different things. Military records from the period are incomplete, partly by design. What the historical record does support clearly and consistently is what followed. Accounts from the period indicate that a major confrontation erupted in the central Melbourne pub district, involving significant numbers of Australian and American servicemen, with civilians drawn into the violence as the fighting spread. It did not stay in one location. That is the characteristic of a riot rather than a brawl. The way momentum builds, the way bystanders become participants, the way the original trigger becomes irrelevant because what has been released is larger than any single cause. Bottles became weapons, fists connected with faces, groups organised along national lines with the speed of men who had been waiting, perhaps without fully knowing it, for exactly this permission to stop pretending everything was fine. The fighting moved through the surrounding streets, pulling in anyone who was present and forcing everyone else off the footpath. Military police from both the Australian and American forces responded. The response required significant numbers of personnel and took time to be effective, which tells you something about the scale of what they were walking into. This was not a disturbance that two MPs could talk down. It was a street-level collapse of the order that military discipline was supposed to maintain. When the arrested were processed, the total ran to a significant number, enough that military authorities on both sides understood immediately that what had happened could not be allowed to become public. Sit with that number for a moment. Because in any other context, any context where the story was allowed to be told publicly, even a handful of arrests in one night in the centre of a major city would be a significant news event. It would generate investigations, official statements, public debate. It would be the kind of incident that shapes how people understand a period. In December 1942 in Melbourne, it generated none of those things, because by the next morning, the machinery of suppression was already running. Australia's wartime censorship apparatus was well established by late 1942. The government had developed clear guidelines for what the press could and could not report, and those guidelines were applied with particular force to anything that could damage Allied morale or complicate the political relationship with the United States. Confrontations like what happened in Melbourne were exactly the kind of story those guidelines existed to bury, and the near-total absence of contemporary reporting is itself evidence of how effectively that suppression worked. Both Australian and American military authorities understood within hours what the consequences of public coverage would be. The Pacific Campaign was at a critical stage. Australian and American forces were fighting together in New Guinea at that precise moment, fighting and dying together in some of the most brutal jungle warfare of the entire war. The idea that those same forces had spent the previous night rioting against each other in a Melbourne pub district was not a story that could be managed once it was public. So it was kept from becoming public not through a single dramatic decision, through the accumulation of small ones. No press releases, no official statements, charges processed quietly through military channels where possible, minimizing the paper trail. Editors who might have heard rumors received the message, directly or indirectly, that this was not a story they should pursue. And it worked. Melbourne woke up the next morning to newspapers that said nothing about what had happened the night before. The city went back to functioning. The Alliance went back to presenting a unified face to the world. The men who had been arrested were processed and returned to their units. The broken glass was swept up. And the Melbourne Riot entered the category of things that happened but were not allowed to have happened, real in the memory of everyone who was there, non-existent in the official record. This suppression worked on the official record. It did not work on the men who were there. The men who were arrested knew what had happened. The military police who responded knew. The pub staff who had taken cover behind their counters knew. The civilians who stepped around broken glass on their way to work the next morning knew. And the story moved the way stories always move when official channels close, through conversation, through barracks rumour, through letters written carefully enough to pass the censors, but clearly enough for the person reading them to understand. That underground circulation fed directly into the phrase that was already moving through Australian streets, and that would prove more durable than any wartime censorship order. Overpaid, oversexed, over here. The phrase existed before December 1942. The underlying grievances that produced it had been building since the Americans first arrived. But the Melbourne Riot gave it something that a phrase without a concrete story can never quite achieve. A moment of proof, not just resentment as feeling, but resentment as event. Not just men grinding their teeth in pub doorways, but dozens of arrests on a footpath covered in glass. The phrase had always been true. After December 1942, it had evidence. Melbourne was not an isolated eruption. It was part of a pattern of confrontations between Australian and American forces that played out across multiple cities through 1942 and into 1943. Each one shaped by the same structural pressures, and each one managed where possible through the same official silence. Brisbane had already seen its own collision. The Battle of Brisbane in November 1942, a larger and deadlier confrontation that has received somewhat more historical attention precisely because it was harder to contain. Sydney had its incidents. Townsville had its incidents. The geography changed, but the underlying composition remained the same. Two Allied armies, better paid and worse paid, sharing social spaces in a city under pressure, with no serious official provision for what would happen when the friction became heat. The common thread was not simply alcohol or aggression, though both were consistently present. It was the structural reality that the alliance, for all its military necessity, had placed Australian and American servicemen in direct social competition for space, for status, for the company of Australian women, without honestly addressing what that competition would produce. Australian men had been fighting since 1939. They had a claim on their own cities that they felt deeply and personally. The arrival of a foreign force that was better resourced and socially advantaged by its very novelty created conditions that any clear-eyed assessment of human behaviour should have anticipated. The authorities either did not anticipate it or chose suppression over acknowledgement. The result was a series of nights like December 1942 in Melbourne. What makes the Melbourne Riot historically significant is not only what happened, but the deliberate effort to prevent it from being known. The suppression itself is part of the historical record, and it tells you something precise about the limits of official history. The alliance between Australia and the United States in 1942 was militarily genuine and strategically necessary. Without American forces, Australia's position in the Pacific was genuinely precarious in ways that the fall of Singapore had made impossible to deny. That strategic reality is true and should not be minimised. But alliances carry costs that do not appear in official accounts. The social costs of the American presence in Australian cities, the daily displacement, the accumulated resentment, the violence that occasionally broke through the maintained surface of Allied solidarity was real, and it was paid by ordinary Australians who had no say in the arrangement and no legitimate channel through which to express what they were experiencing. The men arrested on Burke Street in December 1942 were those costs made briefly and violently visible, and then made invisible again by morning. The Melbourne Riot matters because it is an honest piece of Australian wartime history, not the heroism of Kokoda, not the strategic partnership celebrated in anniversary speeches, but the complicated, uncomfortable, genuinely human reality of what it meant to live through 1942 in a city that had been transformed by forces beyond anyone's individual control. The men who fought that night on both sides were not villains. They were young men under enormous pressure, operating in conditions of fear and scarcity and uncertainty, colliding with each other in a pub district because the system that had placed them there had made no real provision for what would happen when they did. They were the entirely predictable product of a situation that nobody in authority was willing to address honestly. The Australian government buried the story because it was inconvenient. The alliance required it. The war effort required it. And so the men who lived that night carried it with them quietly in the way that people carry things the official world has decided not to acknowledge. But they left something behind. 3 words coined in fury that proved more durable than any censorship order. Walk down Burke Street today and there is nothing to mark what happened in December 1942. No plaque, no memorial. The pub district that was the centre of that collision has changed beyond recognition. The men who were there are gone. The world that produced that night has vanished almost completely. Almost. Because the phrase survived. And because of videos like this one, the night that produced it is starting to be remembered as well. Now you know what happened, you know what caused it, and you know why it was buried. The full story behind the social tensions that made that night inevitable, the pay gap, the dance halls, the war brides, the lasting consequences for Australian families, is the subject of our other video. It is the companion piece to everything you've just heard, and the two are much stronger together than either one is alone. That link is in the description and the title is pinned in the comments below. Go watch it next. If this story deserved to be told, if the men who lived that night in December 1942 deserve to have it remembered, then do something simple. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There is a lot more of this history that was buried, and we're going to dig all of it up.